private property is more than just owning assets. The first thing that you own is your thoughts and your labor. In a true socialist/communist environment, the government will eventually lay claim to those things.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley inContext. And leading up to our presidential election this year, we opted to interview a number of subject matter experts to help us think biblically, think critically about the election. It's very easy to become uber polarized. It's very easy to take a right versus left, a pro versus anti. And beyond that, we wanted to think a little bit and encourage our friends to think along with us. We asked a number of guests to come on who have different areas of expertise. And today we're going to be talking to one who comes from an economic background. This particular program is focused on a Pew Research Center that was published in February this year that noted Americans' top policy priorities in 2024. Number one was strengthening the economy. That subject outweighed everything else of concern, including terrorism, money in politics, healthcare costs, education, keeping Social Security financially sound, even reducing crime and immigration. This concern about strengthening the economy was number one on the list. I've talked to a number of friends in recent days, just anecdotally, about what are your concerns. And it typically ranges from the border, but often it comes back to kitchen table politics. How do you pay for the mortgage? How do you buy groceries? How do you fill up your tank of gas for your vehicle? Income's gone flat, if at all. Our expenses, inflation are going up. On top of all this, we've got concerns globally. We've got concerns about world poverty. And many churches are involved in good efforts to help developing or so-called third world nations around the world, but we don't see any significant change. It's all out there in our heads swirling around. We can become disenfranchised, we can be despair, or we can be disinterested because our little vote, our opinion, doesn't really matter. On top of all this, the ubiquitous stock market goes up and down with any announcement. And then on July 13th of this year, former President Trump has attempted assassination on his life, and it recalibrates everything from markets to opinions all down the line. How does a believer navigate all this with this upcoming election? Dr. Brian Baugus is the Associate Professor of Business, Leadership, and Management at Regent University. He is the author of dozens of academic papers, 2 books, A Biblical Path for a Prosperous Society, and An Economic Theory of Homeschooling. As always, we have information about our guest in the show notes. You can learn more about Brian. His doctorate and master's, his first ones, are from George Mason University. He also earned an MBA from Vanderbilt University in finance. He's involved in entrepreneurial programs in Africa. I'll leave those details to our show notes. He lives in the Tidewater area of Virginia. Interesting anecdote. He's on has over 200 animals on his property. That would be a podcast all in itself, Brian.
Yeah, it certainly has its ups and downs, let me tell you.
And your wife is a midwife, I understand.
She is.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Home birth midwife.
Thanks for joining us on the broadcast. Well, first of all, let's give me the landscape. Help our listeners. We talk a lot about what's fair and what's equitable in language today. And you've done great study in Deuteronomy and great study in a biblical understanding of what God designed for economics and income and distribution. But boy, we hear these terms a lot, Brian. It's not fair. It's not equitable.
Well, I'm going to probably say something that may even shock some of viewers and listeners, but I hate the term fair for the simple fact that you can project onto it whatever it is that you want to believe. It's a very easy term to throw out. Someone say a common phrase, the rich don't pay their fair share. Well, what are the definitions of that? What is fair, and how unfair is the process and the program? So maybe the more appropriate term is what is efficient. I'm an economist. We're interested in efficiency, but when it comes to the biblical model, the real what is God's plan? That's the plan that's going to meet the right definition of fair, the right definition of just, and that's what the intention of my book is, and what I try to teach in my classes as well as we go forward. So, how's a Christian supposed to think about the economy? There's a lot of different ways that you can answer that question, but one that probably concerns me the most because I deal with college students a lot is that about, and I forget which source this was, but about 40% in a recent survey I saw of young Christians under the age of 30. Again, young's one of those terms too. It keeps changing as I age
Yeah.
what young means, right? Of younger Christians feel that socialism is a fair, an appropriate, and even a biblically
Yes.
consistent approach to thinking about the economy. Now, I think our older generation, our generation, the ones ahead of us, probably react to that with surprise and shock, but we grew up in an era where where the idea of socialism and communism was defined by, Brezhnev and the Russian, all the dark Russians sitting on their wall watching the May Day parade and things of that nature. And I would say that maybe a lot of those folks respond to that concept from that perspective, but never really thought about it from a biblical perspective either. The communists, I mean, Marx, the godfather of communism, was also very anti-Christian as well as anti-capitalist. We don't talk about that as much, but he thought the two were linked at the hip, and that if you were one, you were the other. Right? I mean, the theological position of a true communist is atheism. And he felt that if you were a Christian, that you were by definition a capitalist, which was his term. He invented the term capitalism. And so we need to think about that. He would be rolling over in his grave, which, by the way, you have to pay to visit in London now, right? I love that little anecdote that you have to pay to visit Karl Marx's grave. But he'd be rolling over in his grave if he thought there was such a thing as a Christian socialist. And I think I don't agree with him on much else, but I think he's probably right. Because the first place that I start talking to my students is, what does the Bible say about property? Property is the definitional construct here. Socialism isn't a fairer, nicer way to organize the economy. Socialism has a strict definition, and the first socialism and its bigger brother communism is the abolition of private property. There is no private property. And so, what does the Bible say about property? Well, the Bible says, don't steal. That implies that there's ownership. The Bible says, don't covet. That implies that there's ownership. The Bible says to the Israelites, don't move the property boundaries when you come into the promised land. That implies that there's property ownership. God gave every square inch of Israel when he brought them out of the wilderness into Israel. Every square inch was owned by somebody. We have the record. All those boring genealogies that your pastor might go through and something, those were important land record records for the Israelites at the time, and they were vitally important until the exiles came along. They were vitally important about who had claims on what and who owned what and so forth. Every square inch of Israel was owned. God is a fan and a supporter and an advocate for private property. Now the question then becomes, socialism, and Marx says that private property is the original, in his terminology, the original sin, the original economic sin is private property. All evil in the socialist communist construct descends from private property. God's saying that private property is the way that we practice good stewardship. You take care of something you own better than you take care of something you don't own. It's actually very interesting to note, and I'm not a Greek scholar, this is more your territory than mine, but the word oikonomia, the Greek word oikonomia, appears in the New Testament about 50 or so times. It's always translated as steward or stewardship in the New Testament. It is the exact same word from which we get the word economics, economist, and economy. It's the exact same word. So if you want to be a good steward, taking care of property that's been put into your trust, which every piece has, God owns it all, right? As Kuyper says, every square inch God claims is his. But we are entrusted and are allowed to manage it as though it is our own. Calvin talks about the goal here is not to leave something as you found it, but to leave it in a better shape than you found it. That involves investment. That involves work. You had a very good conversation with a fellow a little while ago about work. I listened to that conversation. It involves work and involves the kinds of things that we see in a various numbers of parables that Jesus tells about. The kingdom of heaven is like the master who leaves talents with his servants, and the two that get rewarded were the ones who went and invested them and earned more. Right? And the one that preserved, he didn't lose his talent, he preserved it from Matthew 20. He preserved it by burying it, and he gets punished, and mean and unnatural things were done to him. Right? So that all descends from the concept of private property. And so that's one of the first lessons that I try to get across to my students and to any other Christian that I talk to about this is don't get caught up in the idea that because socialism sounds lovely, lots of things on paper sound lovely. The practical realities is it's not what God ordered, and it's not how society works. And there's a reason that any place you go where it's really been socialism's truly been tried, ends up being a disaster.
Well, when we hear the economy of language, to me, is also critical because the way these things are talked about is very different from the way you've just defined them. When you hear socialism discussed in our country by our political leaders, it's the idea of this fair share, this equity, that there shouldn't be billionaires. And I always scratch my head and go, well, if there aren't billionaires, then where do these corporations come from that employ thousands of people if you don't have wealth in a free market economy? But it's unfair they make so much money. And so this is sort of the skewed view of the elite. And we are, unfortunately, the minions of those despicable people who are taking advantage of a free market economy.
I mean, you hear you hear some in Congress, and it's become a louder voice. Although the socialism has been with us as an idea in this country for years. Eugene Debs ran for president under the socialist ticket back in the 90s, and a couple of economists that I respect argue that he was maybe the most effective losing candidate of all time because he ran on a platform. Listen to this. He ran on a platform when it wasn't acceptable. He ran on a platform of Social Security, minimum wage, 8-hour work week, pro-union, right? Something that both parties now defend with vigor. You can't get a minimum wage law through unless you're increasing it, even in the state legislative level. And yet 95% of the economic research papers out there argue that the minimum wage creates unemployment, especially among minority youths. And yet you can't get the minimum wage changed. Also, some of the countries that some of these folks like to point to, like Sweden and Germany, as being models of a more socialist economic arrangement, they actually don't have a minimum wage in Sweden and Germany, for instance. But minimum wage is we'll put that aside for now. The key the catchphrase in this country right now is democratic socialism, right? If you put the word democratic in front of it, it sounds more palatable, more American. But as I point out to students who bring it up in class, I said, remember in that phrase, the democratic part is the adjective, socialism is the noun, right? And the democratic part is the window dressing. The socialism is still the abolition of private property, whether you do it by a commander who's in who's had a junta and is taken over, or you do it by vote. It's still a violation of a natural right that comes from God to own property. And a lot of my students who haven't thought about it very rigorously forget the fact that private property is more than just owning assets. The first thing that you own is your thoughts and your labor. And in a true socialist/communist environment, the government will eventually lay claim to those things. They'll take your land first. They'll take your business first. They'll take your farm first. But eventually they will take your thoughts.
Well, they're already doing that.
And they already do that. And that's happening. I mean, that's happening now. That's what I'm saying is that we are in a situation where those who feel that they are our betters are claiming that we aren't allowed to think certain ways. And that's a dangerous place to be in. I mean, this is Orwellian, and I know that a lot of people don't read George Orwell much anymore, but they should, because some people view it as a warning, and other people seem to view it as a how-to manual.
Ouch. Well, I mean, you're the professor. I contend most people don't read. Period. It's not
Well,
anymore.
there's some
They
truth
just
to that.
don't
You can
read.
put it in you can put it in a comic book form or maybe an animation, and they'll check it out.
I was just talking to an author who wants me to review his book. I said, well, if it's have a lot of pictures and 30 words per page, otherwise we're in trouble. Talk to me a little bit, because I want to take this to a nomenclature that I would say is a little more accessible. Personal responsibility, free market economy, work ethic. I mean, when the way perhaps you and I was raised was you work hard, you get there a little early, pick up a broom, ask if you can help, do your job, do a little bit more than the other guy, and you'll probably get a raise, you'll probably get a promotion, you'll get a good recommendation. But it's personal responsibility, it's a work ethic, it's an attitude, I'm here to help, as opposed to an entitlement. And this to me has been the most tectonic shift in thinking, Brian, is that we expect someone else to underwrite our lifestyle of binging Netflix or living on TikTok or whatever it may be. And talk about a dead-end experience. If I wasn't forced to get out and mow yards, shine shoes at a barber shop, trim hedges, learn how to, work on cars to pay my way through college and seminary, if I wasn't trained to do those things, I don't know where I'd be today.
It is interesting, and I have like a flood of thoughts as you're speaking, and I'll try to stay focused here. But it is interesting that it seems to be among the respectable classes of people that forcing your child to get a summer job, a part-time job, is beneath them these days. That there's, work has become, and I don't mean this in a punny way, but work has become a four-letter word for those under the age of 18. You hear phrases, even as I was kind of aging out of this, you hear phrases like, well, you're going to work all your life, you should have some fun when you're a kid. Well, I don't disagree with having some fun when you're a kid. There is childhood play that's important, but even play is supposed to have an educational aspect to it. The problem is that people now think that they're allowed to play well into their mid-20s. But let's compare and contrast. Public school system. If you think about the public school system, what are kind of the benchmarks, the searing memories, and I'm a graduate of a public school system, of searing memories of the public school system? Way that you walk in lines, you respond to bells that ring, you go from class to class with the group, right? There's this regimentation about the public school system. And how do you succeed in the public schools, in the education system? By performing well based upon what the teacher is expecting. Now, go into the marketplace. How do you perform well in a marketplace? By serving others better than they expected. Christians, and this is a part that often gets my students scratching their heads a little bit, because they haven't heard this formulation. And I think that some of this goes into seminary education, to be honest with you, that I don't think that pastors think about these things, would be up and coming pastors think about these things, and I don't think they're taught much in seminary. But what is the marketplace? What is the business? A business is the primary way that we serve other people. What does a business actually do? It takes resources. Classically, in an economic formulation, resources are land, natural resources, labor, human resources, and capital, physical resources that we can develop, machines, computers, and so forth. It takes resources. It mixes them together based upon an entrepreneur's vision of what should be done, and produces goods and services to sell to people. Now, everybody realizes that, but let's push it through a Christian lens. Taking those resources is a stewardship function, using the things that we've been given in a productive way. The entrepreneur's vision is a creative function. What's the first thing we learn about God? In the beginning, God created. By word 5, we find out God is a creator, right? He created us in his image. Part of that image is that we are creative beings. So this entrepreneur, his vision may be right, his vision may be wrong. Most entrepreneurial endeavors fail. A lot of them try again, though, and get it right. Right? All the famous ones failed at least once. But Steve Jobs was fired from Apple at one point, right? Henry Ford went bankrupt twice before he found out how to make cars. Thomas Edison's first invention was concrete furniture, right? All these guys failed at first, but they get it right. The creative vision, they keep trying, and then they put it together and they sell it to customers at a price they can afford. That's a service. Stewardship. Vision and creativity, service. The primary way that people get fed in a functioning economy, that the hungry are fed, that the thirsty get water, that the naked get clothed, is through the marketplace, not through charity. Charity fills in the gaps, but the primary way that we fulfill those commands is through the marketplace. Christians need to realize that we don't serve only when we go to our church's soup kitchen or clothing pantry. We serve every single day that we get up and go into the marketplace. And if you start thinking about it that way, I think you can start seeing, and this dovetails with your conversation about work to some extent. You start thinking about your work as a calling, no matter what it is that you're doing, and you start thinking about maybe your boss is a jerk, maybe you don't like the people you work around, but are you serving those customers? You're working as if for God, and are you serving customers well? And the customers may be 2 or 3 steps removed from what you're actually doing, but you still need to have that kind of a focus, that this is the primary way in which I am using my God-given talents, stewardship, to serve others. We spend, a good Christian will spend, maybe 5, 6 hours in church? Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening. I mean, depends on what. But how many hours a week will you spend in work? 40 is the standard work week. Some spend a good bit more. As you said, some are trying to spend less, but they get over that eventually if they actually want to make any money. But so if you think of work as the thing that you're trying to is the necessary evil to get to the things that you want to do, you'll miss the point that your work is what you're supposed to be doing. You're called to this, and if you're not liking what you're doing, then you need to think about what your calling is. Assess your talents, assess your skills. The model for us on this is the church. What is the church? Pastors don't like this, so just hang on. Don't get upset at me yet. The church is nothing more than a marketplace model. What do we have at the church? We have people with different skills. Some preach, some teach, some have hospitality, some have administration, some have prophecy, right? Different skill sets. They're all given different skill sets. They come together as one body, as Paul tells us. And what do? We let the preacher serve us by preaching, and then we serve him by the fact that we're the hospitable ones, and we invite the people over to dinner, or whatever it is that we do to express our hospitality. The marketplace is the same way. We have different skills. It's a division of labor, just like at the church. It's a division of labor, and in the marketplace we come together. Sometimes we serve, sometimes we are served.
The challenge, I think, from a nationalistic viewpoint, not global at this point, is I think most of what you articulated is not being taught anywhere.
Well, you come to Regent University and sign up for Econ 120 and you'll get it.
Touche. That's the 1%, right?
So less of that.
So you look at the local church, and as being a churchman for 40-some years, we were blamed for everything. From injustice to inequity to not feeding the poor. I mean, down the line, it was like, well, we did a lot of these things, but you just didn't know about it. Be that as it may, the family structure. And we've got a tumultuous situation with broken families, single parents, marrying late, fewer children. You know this far better than me. Where this stuff was taught, I mean, father knows best pejoratively. You get your blank out the door and go get a job. You want an allowance, go mow a yard. That's how I was raised. And in that, and as we've talked about work ethic, as you mentioned with another guest, you learn so much. I mean, having someone else tell you good job, or someone else tell you, let me show you, that's not the way you want to do it. Let me teach. The number of guys that taught me a thing, unbelievable. When I was a mechanic, and this 30-year guy that, knew more about mechanics than I had ever dreamed, helping me with problems coming over, and it was almost this covetous, I have knowledge and you're a college boy, you're an idiot, and he would just smile at me. And he was right. And he would come over and show me a technique to solve a problem I couldn't fix and just laugh at me. And I was like, that was worth more than a college semester, because
Sure.
I was learning from a guy that had done this procedure 100 times, like a surgeon and a medical student. What happened to us from a critical thinking standpoint that we didn't understand? A work ethic is a path, not only to knowledge, not only to responsibility, not only to feeling accomplished, but a path for economic prosperity. And none of that's bad, Brian.
It is an interesting change over the last 40 or 50 years. Um, I have an acquaintance who argues that I learned things in school, but I learned how to serve and be valuable to others in my first job. And I believe that, and I don't want to get too far down the path into areas that I'm not as familiar with, like sociology and so forth. But there was a fundamental shift in the thinking, and I'll lay it at the feet of the '60s to some extent. A fundamental path in thinking of moving out of the generation that knew how to serve others because they'd been through the Depression, they'd been through the war, World War II, the greatest generation, they into what has been referred to as the me generation, the singular focus. And so we went from being the kind of people who, you know, the family down the street, yeah, we're poor, but the family down the street's even suffering even more than we are, so we're going to help them out kind of thing, to if it doesn't feel good to me, I'm not going to do it. In a matter of about a 15-year span, to a large extent, right? The rise of this of the Timothy Leary type of tune in, turn on, drop out, feel if it feels good, do it, and all that kind of pop philosophy kind of stuff has kind of been culcated into the baked into the entire mindset of all the generations that have followed after that, unless there's been a deliberate attempt by people to break out of it. Christ, of course, can break you out of it because Christ says, "Love others more than you love yourself." You're called to a different kind of mindset. But it's a mindset. So when I deal with my folks in Africa, I ask them, I say, I talk to my partners. I said, you have me in for a lecture or something. What is it that you want me to do? What is the message I can bring? He says, it's always about mindset. You got to do everything to change your mindset. He says, we got two kinds of problems. He says, one is that we have a dependency slash expectation mindset here in Africa, but I don't think it's that much different anyplace else. He says, and we have I'll say they don't quite say it this way, but a work ethic problem. You drive down the streets in some places and you see able-bodied guys just lounging about. Now, Africa's a different kind of place. There's a lot of other corruptive issues and so on and so forth. But these are guys who could be doing something, and they're just lounging about playing board games in front of a store. I mean, they're doing what we used to think of as the purview of 90-year-old men sitting out playing checkers on the general store front porch after they've lived a productive life. These are 20-somethings who are doing the same thing and don't have any aspiration to live a productive life. They're expecting someone to come up and give them, take care of them, as it were. And I think we have some of that, maybe more than of it than I realize, in this country. The idea that you can be on your parents' insurance. It's just as one little tip of it until you're 26 years old as a government policy. 26 years old, right? You watch the.
Sorry.
I mean, we just passed the anniversary of D-Day last month, right? Those guys, the average age of those guys was 19. Right? I mean, they're scaling the walls in an onslaught of enemy crossfire at 19 years of age, and we're saying 26-year-olds, we're not even expecting them to get a job. It's it it's a softening and a coarsening and, dare I say, a feminizing of the male in this
Well,
country.
and you bring up the 60s, and this will be something, if we ever get non-revisionist historians to tell the story, the pill and the revolution changed the country forever. And there was no responsibility. And as you said, Timothy Leary's famous quote, at the end of the day, I'm back to, let's come to today, in 2024. The young men and women you talk to, and I would just say even across age groups, when they think of the economy, Brian, most of them are going to glaze over. It's in the realm of policy. Our good friend, Dr. Rob Schwartzwalder, and I often talk about, the things we chat about. And I'm going to sound like an elitist saying this, less than 1% of the population ever entertains.
Sure, sure. I mean, have you seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off? right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You know the scene I'm talking about where Ben Stein is the economics high school
Professor.
economics teacher, and they're all passed out on their desks, drooling and asleep, and so forth. I use that clip all the time. And this generation hasn't seen that movie. It's a great movie. You know, it's a defining movie of our generation, at least my generation, right? I'm high school or early college when it came out. Um, and you're right. People don't like to talk about this stuff, but like you said, this is the number one issue on their mind for the election. So there's this disconnect between, well, that's that stuff over there, and okay, so how's that stuff over there actually
But
affecting
let me
household
interrupt.
decisions?
Let me interrupt and maybe clarify my question a little bit. But when I look at my mortgage, I mean, it was $100 to fill up my truck the other day. In God's kindness, I got $100 to fill up my truck. But I look at people on the gas line with different, cars, older cars, the guy that's got a lawn service, and I go, that's a lot of money for that person. They don't have that economic bandwidth. And when we go to the grocery store, we don't even buy certain goods right now. We've stopped buying certain products because it's not worth the money to us. And going out to eat, that's a big decision today. I took a guy to lunch the other day. It was $138 for the two of us to have lunch and an iced tea and a club soda. $38. And this wasn't like, prime rib. And I went, we've lost our mind. Now, I can do that. In God's great kindness, He's blessed me far beyond what I deserve. Most people can't. And when they look at an election, they're going to vote their constituency in their pocketbook. Some of them. Some of them are going to differentiate and go, no, I can't make enough money no matter who's in office. Give it to me.
Yes. Yeah, you're going
And
to
that
have
seems to be
the dependency expectation mindset involved. Absolutely.
So help us out there. So if I'm going to the polls, no, I'm serious. I'm going to the
Yeah.
polls. How do I do a differentiation to go, wait a minute, if I work hard and do this, I'm still up against an inflationary curve, goods and services. We were talking the other day about supply economics here in Middle Tennessee. From the supply chain debacle, the pandemic, how that downstream has affected things. The goods and products I'm getting today are junk compared to what they were a decade ago.
And we want to keep in mind, and I hear your question and we will answer it, but we want to keep in mind that the disaster that was the pandemic was not because of the disease, but because of the government response to
100%. Yeah, you had no argument for me there.
it. Yeah.
Now,
Right.
whether
Because
we can
we've
explain
lived
that
through,
to the country.
you and I think we're roughly the same age. You and I have lived through like 9 pandemics in our lifetime. This was the only one. This was the only one that had that. Well,
sorry.
here's the thing that's interesting. There was a pandemic. There was a pandemic the summer of Woodstock, but they didn't cancel Woodstock. If you go look up, there was a pandemic. I forget what it was, but there was some kind of pandemic. Believe it or not, I believe it was out of China. But there was a pandemic going on during that summer. About 150,000 Americans died from some disease that, and again, I was only a few years old at the time. I was not cognizant. This was historical reading. But kitchen table issues. The thing that's on a lot of people's minds, of course, is inflation. And here's the problem to some extent with inflation. Inflation is controlled largely, not exclusively, but largely by an unelected group called the Federal Reserve Board. Right? Now, the president appoints the members of the Federal Reserve Board and the Senate approves them, but once they're on, they can't be removed. They're not even a strict government agency. They are a quasi-private, quasi-government agency. They are required to report to the Senate every once in a while and to the president every once in a while, but you can't fire them, you can't unelect them, you can't impeach them. The Federal Reserve Board is technically owned, Federal Reserve System is technically owned by the nation's banks, not controlled by the government. They control the money supply. Inflation is always a money supply issue. So what's the downstream? The government closed the economy. We have a 33% unemployment, short-term spike, but it was still 33% unemployment. People are hurting. So what do? They engage in massive spending, which is the other side of the issue, with stimulus checks and so forth. It's a fallacy that the government can actually stimulate the economy, but we can come back to that if you want to. Stimulus checks and an increase of the money supply by the Federal Reserve Board. What does that do? Well, it gives you a temporary relief. You actually do have some money in your pocket, but it creates the conditions in which you're going to have high inflation, right? There is no free lunch. If you're going to have a benefit now that is created out of thin air, so to speak, you're going to have a cost later that has to be paid for. So how do you get the inflation under control? Well, you get the people in the Federal Reserve Board who are actually curious and interested in stopping the inflation, and you get a government that has a constraint, actually has a constraint on spending. And here's an issue I have with both candidates and both parties, I should say, not just both candidates, is neither right now seem to be very interested in spending restraint. There are some in both sides that talk it, but as a policy issue, as a philosophical a part of their governing, neither party seems to be terribly interested in saying we got to get this spending under control and get back into what we might think of as good stewardship of the nation's accounts. There's some research.
Can I ask a question? You're
Yeah.
the economist. Ask a question. So when you look, granted, you're right. When you look at the federal deficit, national deficit, and the national debt, you can't even begin to address those. I mean,
No,
the spending is out of control, and the debt is out of control. And there's no way. I think I saw something. It's been 6 months back. The per capita amount to repay the debt, you couldn't earn that in a lifetime.
well, no, you're not going.
The average
Most
American
people
couldn't.
won't.
So
No,
I asked.
I mean, they call back in the 1830s, a wag in Britain referred to the economics as the dismal science. So I'll be dismal for a few minutes. Um, if you take all of the current debt, right, and let's make a distinction, the deficit for folks. The deficit is how much the government spends in a given
Overspent.
year over what it collects in revenues. The debt is the accumulation of all those deficits since time began, which actually is not that long ago. There was, through the Eisenhower years, a very much a philosophical approach that the government needs to balance its books. The advent of the idea of deficit spending, which has its roots in an economist named John Maynard Keynes, a Cambridge economist who was trying to come up with ways to address the Depression back in the 30s. But the first president administration that was brought up under what they referred to then as the new economics, what we now refer to as Keynesian economics, was Kennedy. And from Kennedy forward, and Nixon has a famous quote, "We are all Keynesians now," right? Because Keynes, his philosophy gave the politicians intellectual cover to engage in deficit spending on a regular basis. So we've done that. In my lifetime, and I'm in my late 50s. In my lifetime, we've actually had 4 balanced budgets since I was born in the United States. But here's the more dismal part. Because of Social Security and the fact that the Congress authorized itself to raid the Social Security Trust Fund in the 1960s and has been doing so, so there's actually no money in the Social Security Trust Fund right now. Right? Current payers are paying current recipients. So there's no money in Social Security, there's no money in Medicare, there's no money in Medicaid. All of that is being funded on current budget situations, and those are the 3 biggest items, along with defense. Those are the 4 biggest items in the federal budget. Everything else is minuscule compared to those 4. If you take the present value, that's a financial term, but if you take the present value, which is if we were going to have to pay all of that off today, it would cost more money to do that than the world produces in a year. The unfunded the current debt plus the unfunded obligations that the government has committed itself to exceeds $90 trillion. And the world GDP, global GDP, and annual GDP is somewhere like 85 to 90 trillion. It's very close. The world doesn't produce enough money to pay off the American debt.
Absent an economic collapse, is there any way?
I got good news on this. I don't want to just leave you with bad news, right? You know, kind of doing the preacher thing. You are a sinner, but there's salvation. Right? Here's the good news, but first of all, the voters are part of the issue, and I hate to say that, but you look in the mirror, one of the things that's a problem is that the American citizen likes to get a lot of government and not pay much for it. We like our benefits. I mean, just Just look at the results of public polling. We like our benefits. I love the guy I saw that says, this is during the Obama administration. He says, I don't want any of that Obamacare. They better keep their hands off of my Medicare. Right? Medicare is a government insurance
Yeah.
program.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. If we were to get an administration and a government, now this is a big if, I get it, but if we were to have a change in our attitude, and I think this may be one of the biggest things that the Christians can bring to this conversation, a change in our attitude that we want the government to live within its means. And what we mean by that is do not grow any faster than the economy is growing. That's the main way that we get a deficit, is that government spending grows faster than the GDP. Government increases its spending by 5%, GDP grows by 3%. That 2% is unjustified to a large extent. If we can get the government to freeze its spending for about 10 years and then not grow any faster than GDP, we can actually have a balanced budget in, well, this is the hard part, in about 100 years. That's what the research shows. We've got to freeze the spending for about 2 administrations and then reduce the growth rate. Yes. The good news is that it's possible. The bad news is that political incentives don't really reward that because,
well, the immediacy of all of us, I mean, I'm a bit older than you. I'm 67. And the immediacy of when you get to the, quote, retirement years and you realize this fixed income or, whatever, that you're now drawing down your retirement. When you talk to my peer, I don't care how much you have, it's a terrifying notion to begin drawing on retirement. I was talking to a financial planner here in the area that manages over $4 billion. And he said, Michael, to a man and woman that we counsel, they all feel that way no matter how much wealth they have. When you begin drawing on your retirement.
Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question about that, because that's something I talk about in my class. Is the American version of retirement biblical?
No.
Okay, I argue it isn't.
Yeah, it isn't. But my point is not that. My point is we vote for our constituency. So when I hear policy, that's why I was mentioning Schwartzwalder. When he and I talk policy, I go, Rob, there's only 3 people that care about this conversation. You, me, and the guys not listening right now. So there's this vacuum of 100 years from now. I mean, unless you're in Japan with a 100-year plan, who thinks beyond the next paycheck or the next car payment or the next car I'm going to get or my starter home. And when I come back to the 24 election, I look at a field of Americans who, I don't be unkind, they wouldn't understand most of what you and I have just talked about. Their fear is, how am I going to pay bills? How am I going to afford college? And now I would push back and say, I don't know that you need to afford college for your children. There's probably less than a handful of universities I'd send my grandchildren to today. It's a completely different universe than when you and I went to college, and university was such an intellectual, spiritual, emotional feast. It was a time of growth, personal responsibility, my classwork, getting it done, taking care of business, graduating. I learned intellectual, spiritual disciplines to carry me to my career. That doesn't even apply anymore, Brian. And so now we're looking at a landscape where I empathize with these people. I'm not mad at them. I empathize with the information they have ingested is no longer giving them a capacity, let's use your language, the economic landscape to advance themselves in a free market economy, personal responsibility, and a work ethic.
Well, we got to get back to, well, let me go back to definitional stuff. We don't live in the, how do I want to say this? To call what the United States has a free market economy is a bit of an insult to the true free market economy. We are a freer market economy, right? I mean, I wouldn't argue that too many countries are getting it more right than we are, but we have a lot of cronyism. We have a lot of favoritism that emanates from government, and that is part of this conversation as well. If I were to sit across from my one grandfather was a farmer, my other grandfather was a small church Baptist preacher. If I was to sit across from either one of them and talk to them about this, they've both passed on at this point, but talk about either one about this, I would, and I would say, what can across the kitchen table, what is it that you can do to accommodate, manage, and survive in this sort of environment? And I say maybe not the first thing, but the first thing you talk about is make sure that you are voting and holding people accountable to what needs to be done. We need to elect people who are actually going to reflect the idea that fiscal responsibility at the state level will be rewarded. Don't vote for a guy who brings home the bacon. Vote for a guy who says no to stuff, because we got to say no. Politically speaking, everybody thinks that the congressman next door is the bad guy. Now look what he voted for his district. Well, the new roof at our school was necessary. It was
Yeah.
appropriate to
The
bring
poor.
home our bacon. Start at home. Um, Jordan Peterson talks about has this thing about make your bed, and people say, "What's that got to do with anything?" It says it's a euphemism for get it right at home before you start telling other people how to do stuff. So how about this? Don't run up your credit card debt. Not that my grandparents either one ever had any problem with that, but I'm just mythical. Don't run up your credit card debt. Make sure you're given a full day's work and a full week's work so that you are the valuable guy at work. Don't go on vacations and engage in things that you can't afford. Make sure that you're voting and holding people accountable for doing the same thing at the state and federal levels. Um, Make sure that that you are investing. If I was talking to a young person, and I have 4 kids, the youngest is 18, the oldest is 30, and I tell them, I says, now is the time, even if it's only $10 a week, start putting money aside so that it can grow. Understand that the long term appreciation of small investments left in place for 30, 40 years are invaluable. I have uh, I manage some family money, my grandparents' farm, and when they passed away and we liquidated it and there was some money to manage. And I was talking to our financial advisors, and they said that there was a study done, and it says the people who do best in investing are the ones who forgot that they had the account, or the owner passed away, left it to them in a will, and they didn't know how to access it, and it just sat there and just grew. The stock market, regardless, and learn a little bit. You don't have to know much to actually get in on the positives and the upsides of this market economy. The American economy, with all its warts and all its flaws and all the negative stuff I've said in this conversation, being all dismal, the American economy has been the greatest engine for creating wealth that the world has ever seen. There are more millionaires, billionaires, people who started off in poverty, who are now well off. Just to use the most recent example, not to get political about this, but if you understand that the Senator Vance that President Trump just picked for his VP running mate, and how he grew up. He wrote it in his book Hillbilly Elegy, and how he is now. He's 39 years old. That's a one generation move from the lowest levels of poverty
Yep.
to the highest. And only in the United States is that kind of social mobility and economic mobility possible. So get in on it early. Invest in the stock market. The stock market has never had a 10-year period where at the end of that 10 years it was lower than it was at the beginning of that 10 years, even during the Great Depression. So if you're 25 years old and you actually get up, go to work, put in a full day's work, live below your means slightly, right? The richest people live at about 80% of what they're actually able to live at. And use that extra 20%. Make sure you tithe, make sure you support your church, but then invest, consistent investment strategy in an easy access, well diversified stock portfolio that reflects American companies. You will beat and you will be a millionaire by age 45, 50.
Yep.
Anybody can do it in this economy. People come from all over the world to do exactly what I just described. And here's the other thing, and this is an important, and we don't have time for this conversation. Get married.
Yep.
Married people aren't
Do
poor.
better.
The
Yep,
single biggest predictor of whether you're in poverty or not is whether you're married or not. 98% of married people live above the poverty line. The overwhelming majority of poor people who are below the federal poverty line are single. And despite what the feminist third wave, fourth wave, 39th wave, whatever they are, despite what the feminists want to tell you, marriage is a better deal for women than it is for men even. 12 to 15% of single women are poor across the country, all ages. Less than 4% of married women are below the poverty line. Everything else being equal, same race, same age, same education status, marriage, because marriage and dedicated to the marriage and making it work, marriage requires being responsible. You're far more likely, if you know someone else is depending upon you, to get up and go to work, to not stay out with the boys or the girls all night, to actually engage in adult mature behavior, which adult mature behavior results in building an income, building a career and a nest egg. Marriage, and we're not married, right? We're not married anymore.
Very late, yeah. And I would add to that, just from a biblical worldview. Marriage will make you into a man or woman that you would never have been apart from learning how to relate to another person, to accommodate, to help, to serve, to encourage each other when one falls down and the other one picks you up. Dr.
Can I end on one last note?
You can.
I just want to end with the Proverbs, virtuous woman in Proverbs, was it 30 or 31? 31. I would encourage all of your listeners and viewers to go read that and look at it the way I do. Read that from verse 10 to the end of the chapter. Talks about what a virtuous woman is. Read how many times she's engaging in business and economic activities. She considers a field and invests in it. She produces cloth for the marketplace. She manages a staff. There are 5 or 6 verses where she is engaging in business. There's one verse where she says she opens her hand to the poor, and that's after she's done all those productive things. Charity is important, but keep in mind the virtuous person is a person who's engaged in the marketplace, and engaging in the marketplace carefully results in the things that passage talks about: respect of her peers, respect of the people in the town. The husband takes his place of honor amongst the other men of town. Her children are always in good shape. All of that descends out of being married and being industrious. And if you're that, you can succeed in any economic situation.
Dr. Brian Baugus, it's been great to have you on the podcast. As always, we have information in the show notes about our guest. You can find out about his publications, his books that are available. Brian, thanks for taking time to join us on In Context.
It was so nice to be here. Thank you very much.